I read The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is part of the Summer of Cosmere that I am doing this year, where I read all of the Cosmere books in the published order that they came out in. And so I'm going to be comparing this to Elantris. So if you don't want spoilers for that, then you should stop listening. And so this is the first Mistborn book. I think for me, it's the first Cosmere book that I ever read when I picked it up years and years ago. The book always feels bigger than I remember whenever I come back to it. It feels like almost like a fantasy trilogy kind of packed into one book, because we get the setup of this dystopian world that has a kind of evil god emperor who is, by the end of the book, overthrown by the heroes Kelsier and Vin. And that feels like the kind of thing that another writer might take 3 books to kind of build up to, but for this series is just the first step in a more apocalyptic story that is going to like reimagine the entire world that these characters live in. Because the world is a kind of set up as if, you know, in the kind of fantasy tropes that we're used to if we are fans of the genre. What if the Dark One had, you know, won the conflict between the Chosen One and the forces of good and evil? What if evil had won? This is the kind of world that the characters live in. So it's like there's ash constantly falling from the sky. The air is so polluted that no one has ever seen the stars at night. All of the plants are brown and desiccated instead of green and vibrant. There are no flowers. And there's an oppressive government that is utterly controlling the lives of all of its citizens, but particularly enslaving a group of people who are called the Ska, and then highly controlling their masters, who are the noble class. And so the whole world is like a real nightmare place to exist in. There's a kind of metatextual thing that Brandon Sanderson is doing where he's taking your kind of knowledge of the genre and turning it on its head in a lot of ways, because this isn't merely a story about a dystopia that gets overturned. There's plenty of fantasy where like the wrong king is in charge and the heroes have to overturn the order. It's that on a deeper level, the world itself is perverted from where it's supposed to be. And for me, that puts it directly in dialogue with Elantris, where we had this similar kind of situation where Elantris had been a utopia and now it was like a complete nightmare place to be. And the reasons for that I talked about in the previous podcast were related to this gap that was between what is true on the deepest level of the universe, if you will, and what is true on a surface level. And so on the surface level, it seemed like Elantris had been cursed, it had been ruined. But on the deeper level, what was wrong was that, you know, it was misaligned in its magic system. And so it was like a machine that was broken and it needed to be recalibrated. And once that happened, then the city, you know, kind of switched back to being this utopian magical place. And our sense in Mistborn, as we go through the book for the first time as readers, I think, is somewhat similar, where the characters talk about like, well, of course I've never seen starlight, or that's a weird idea that there used to be flowers and green plants. Why green? Why not some other color? And we as readers know that like to not have green plants is in some way a fundamentally broken and alien world. There's something like deeply wrong with this world that the characters are just accepting because they've, you know, never known anything else. They can't imagine a world that isn't deeply broken. And so it's not something that they can even fight for. And so by dropping those kind of details about the world and the way that the characters react to it, I think Sanderson is giving us this feeling as readers that the characters don't have, that there is something like deeply off about the world, that it is out of touch with the way that a world, quote unquote, should be. And the characters in Elantris had the benefit of only being a decade out from the utopia, changing into a cursed city. For these characters, it's been 1,000 years. So it's like time out of memory almost for there ever being a different way to live in the world. And that comes down to the influence of the Lord Ruler, who is kind of the dark one, if you will, in this world. He's an immortal god king who is extremely powerful and has ruled over this empire for hundreds and hundreds of years. He's so deeply distorted the experience of his civilization that people just take for granted that this is the way that it should be. But he hasn't fully gotten the people to accept the kind of oppression and violence that his kingdom or empire demands. And I think that that's Sanderson, once again, pointing to an idea that there's something more fundamental in the universe about people, in particular, in this case, the way that I talked about in Elantris. So I still haven't found like a good way to talk about this idea, but there's this gap between what the Lord Ruler wants people to be, these kind of obedient citizens who just go along. They are kind of parts in the machine of his empire, that they can be instrumentalized in what he needs them to be to accomplish the goals that he's trying to achieve, to kind of see the world in the way that he sees it, versus the way that people more naturally want to live. And that's the more fundamental thing that I'm talking about. And so I think in Sanderson's world, what the story is telling us is that people have a natural need for freedom, for connections in terms of family, friendships, and romantic, loving relationships. And all of those things don't fit into the Lord Ruler's vision of what needs to be happening in the world. We get that discontinuity, that gap between what people naturally need and what the Lord Ruler wants people to be, expressed in the two main characters, Kelsier and Vin. Because Kelsier is actively rebelling against the system that the Lord Ruler has created. As soon as we meet him in the story, he goes out and completely destroys a slave plantation. And that's the way that we're introduced to him. So he's kind of like a Robin Hood character, a rebel against the unjust kingdom. And he has all of these magical powers that allow him to have the agency to fight against the Lord Ruler. But he's doing that in a very self-conscious way, where he deliberately understands what the Lord Ruler wants from him and has chosen to do the opposite of that, because he's trying to stay true to this feeling that he has deep down that the world should be different from the way that it is. So he's not purely motivated necessarily by like personal feelings of revenge, although I do think that is a part of his character makeup. And I'll talk more about that when I start comparing the Elantris characters to the Mistborn characters. But he has an ideological point of view that is the exact opposite of the Lord Ruler, that is a decision that he has made as a man. And so it's all very self-conscious, I guess is what I'm saying, when it comes to Kelsier. On the other hand, with Vin, you have a character who is just trying to survive. She's very young when we meet her, 16 years old. She is a peasant, a ska person who has magical powers, but she doesn't understand that she has magical powers. And she is trying her best to fit into the Lord Ruler's system and not stick out, to try and stay under the radar of the entire kind of dystopian system in the way that it snuffs people out. So she's not resisting against the Lord Ruler and instead is trying to conform in order to survive in the world. And she doesn't expect to have strong friendships, to be treated in a fair way, to have loving relationships or romance or anything like that. Instead, she is trying her best to be the kind of person that the Lord Ruler is trying to create at the beginning of the story. She's just trying to fit in and obey the obligators and avoid the inquisitors and fit in to the system for the most part. But she's being used by the thieving class of ska who scam the nobility out of money in order to avoid working as manual laborers on the plantations like the rest of the ska do. And so she's been pulled into this kind of criminal world that exists under this incredibly oppressive world that has to constantly apply force to all of the citizens who live in it to push against their human nature to be self-determining and free, and instead force them to be compliant, willing slaves. And so Vin, I think, is trying to do her best to be a slave because she sees that as the only way to survive in the world. And she's completely suppressed all of her quote unquote normal desires for connection and happiness that Kelsier is fighting to have in the world. And the rest of the story is really about Vin's arc out of that, trying to be compliant to the Lord Ruler's world and aligning more closely with Kelsier's rebellion, while Kelsier kind of arcs slightly out of being filled with a passionate hatred against the noble class and coming to see all of the people as having things in common and needing to be aligned against the Lord Ruler, really coming to see the Lord Ruler as the singular problem in the world that needs to be overturned. And I think Kelsier and Vin have a real push and pull kind of relationship on each other in terms of those arcs. They really motivate and move each other through the story emotionally and intellectually, ideologically, in all of these different ways to change into the people that they end up by the end of the story. And that pushing and pulling is like a big theme in this book in a way that it wasn't in Elantris. And so a big part of even the magic system is this idea that for every push in the world, there is a pull. And I think that is the way that Kelsier as a character is kind of calibrated to respond to the Lord Ruler. So the Lord Ruler puts it out into the world that like everybody needs to obey, everybody needs to be compliant and obedient. And therefore, Kelsier is the push back against that says, I'm going to be rebellious, I'm going to be independent. You want me to be hopeless, therefore I will be hopeful. I won't accept the way that you see the world. Instead, I'm going to replace it with a new dream of how the world could be. And so in Elantris, we had this kind of narrowing throughout the narrative of this gap between who the characters are misrepresenting themselves to be versus who they fundamentally are. And it was a similar thing with the city of Elantris itself, where it seemed to be this cursed place, but underneath, more fundamentally, it is this magical utopian city. And the problem there was needing to close that gap between what it appears to be and what it fundamentally is. And that was kind of true for all of the characters in that story. In Mistborn, while there is a push and pull between the way that the world, quote unquote, should be, or what is natural human behavior that the Lord Ruler is pushing against and imposing his final empire on them, we're not really narrowing the gap between what is more fundamentally natural in the world versus this kind of perversion or distortion that has been forced on it with this dystopian government. I think something more complicated is happening in Mistborn, and it's, Sanderson is kind of troubling the themes that he introduced in Elantris, kind of playing with them a little bit more, making them more sophisticated and complicated by having lots of different pushing and pulling elements underneath the surface between how people fundamentally are, if you will, and who they can be forced to become by the injustices of the world. Because by the end of the story, where Vin lands is a really ambiguous place in terms of her character. And that makes sense because it's the first step in a trilogy. But you could ask yourself, who is Vin fundamentally, underneath how she perceives herself, underneath what is expected of her from the Lord Ruler, from Kelsier, and from all the other, friends and enemies that she has throughout the story, versus, what she wants to be herself or what she is capable of being. And the answer is not really that definitive. It's hard to see where exactly Vin lands. It feels like it's somewhere in the middle. She learns how to begin to trust people and not expect everyone to betray her. She starts to allow herself to desire romance and give in to attraction by forming the beginning of a relationship with Elend. But she also forms these strong friendships with the rest of the thieving crew that are emotionally risky, but feel like something that is a fundamental emotional need of every person, in the world, let alone Vin herself. And so these are the kind of connections that the Lord Ruler doesn't want people to have. They kind of interrupt the ability to be obedient to him. If you're more loyal to your friends and whatnot, if you trust people, if you love people and have this found family that Vin gets into, then what is the incentive for you to be obedient to the Lord Ruler? But in the course of being friends with these people and carrying out the plan that they have to overthrow the empire, she dresses up, in these ballroom gowns. She goes to dances. She takes on a persona of a noblewoman, and she gets to explore this side of herself that enjoys beauty, that likes perfume and makeup and things like that. But is that fundamentally who Vin is? Or is she, at her core, a kind of con artist with magical powers? Is she a street rat survivor who needs to be in these scrappy situations? Is she the kind of person who shouldn't be in fancy clothes and high society situations? It's just all of it is not clear. On a certain level, she's trying to execute a plan formed by other people. And so she's still trying to fit into someone else's mold. And the reasons for doing that might be, more morally justified than following the Lord Ruler's dystopian government. But it doesn't necessarily put her in touch with a more fundamental version of who she is as a person. It just begins that journey. She starts to take those first steps of learning about herself in this story instead, is what I'm saying. And so I don't think there's a closing of a gap between who Vin fundamentally is and who she has been told she should be in this story in the way that there was in Elantris, because that's not what the Mistborn stories are about. So even the magic system in Elantris had to do with this discontinuity between the way that the world was represented in the Aeons and the way that the world actually was. And once that difference was rectified, then all of the problems kind of evaporated in the story. And that was true for the characters themselves. Once they worked out the discontinuities between who they seemed to be and who they actually were, then their conflicts came to an end. In Mistborn, they're more pushing and pulling on these different forces that are at work inside of themselves in a much more complicated way. So what we see in the magic system of the world kind of reflects the themes and the emotional journey that the characters go on. Each one of the powers that the characters have access to is associated with a certain metal, and each of those metals kind of has an opposite, if you will. And so one of the metals will be like being able to push certain metals away from yourself, and then the other kind of magical power has to do with pulling the metals towards you. Or you can kind of smother the emotions of people around you, or you can enhance and inflame the emotions and passions of people around you. So there's this kind of pushing and pulling theme that's built into the magic system. And that's being expressed in the relationships of the characters. They're constantly like moving each other, as opposed to in Elantris, you had Raoden, who was this polarizing figure that would kind of magnetize the other characters to his way of seeing the world, where he himself did not arc or was not deeply changed by the other characters around him. In other words, Raoden was kind of in touch with what was fundamental about the world right from the get-go and kind of pulled everyone towards that fundamental truth. But in Mistborn, the characters are pushing and pulling each other in their arcs. They're changing each other throughout the story constantly. And so Kelsier, I always remember Mistborn as being like, Kelsier has this master plan and he perfectly executes it, and he has like this big vision for how things are going to work. But that's not really correct. So much of Kelsier's plan is improvised and changes, and he adapts to what's going on around him, but also his goals change throughout the story based on his relationships with the other characters. And so he kind of changes his mind about various things throughout the story. For example, he hates the nobility with like a deep passion, in the same way that in Elantris, Delof hated the Elantrians in a kind of irrational, prejudiced way. Kelsier is gleeful and proud of killing noble people and inciting a war within the city, kind of creating chaos among the noble houses. But at the same time, Vin is spending all of this time at the dances with the nobility and learning about this desire that she has for beauty and elegance, and her appreciation for the architecture of the different castles that the balls are happening in, and all of the art that is in those places, and the actual dancing itself, and the elegance and elevated culture of that whole situation, and the way in which the nobles are people who have thoughts and feelings and desires for relationships and all of these other things. They're real people, and she gets to know them on a more personal level. And so when Kelsier talks about murdering them, it kind of hurts her feelings, and she feels conflicted about him doing that. And her expressing that to him pulls him out of this irrational and passionate hatred that he has into a more moderate position that maybe not all of the noble people are bad. And so at the end of Kelsier's story, when he saves Elend from being killed, he doesn't do that merely because of the way that he feels about Vin, but for Elend's own sake, and because it is the final kind of destination of his arc of changing from being filled with this kind of passionate bigotry against the nobility, like Dilaf had for the Elantrians, to understanding that there needs to be an alliance between the Ska and the nobility if they're going to successfully create a new civilization after the Lord Ruler dies. And so I think there are elements of, I talked about how Dilaf is kind of the archetypal villain of the Cosmere, that we can compare villainy throughout the Cosmere to the way that Dilaf has been created as a character. And so you can see the irrational, passionate hatred is a quality that's folded into Kelsier that is a real problem, I think, in the story. Like, the story takes that moral failing really seriously in Kelsier. And also within Kelsier, the rest of his crew has a really bad reaction to the way that he deploys religion in a kind of cynical way that is going to control the lives and beliefs of the Ska in the Empire to align with his goals. There's a way in which Kelsier is trying to remake society that isn't so dissimilar from the Lord Ruler himself, right? Like, the Lord Ruler does it through a deliberate kind of supremacy that operates in violence. Anybody who rebels against him is totally obliterated in a violent way, but he has created a religion which has deliberately extinguished all the competing religions and demands total obedience from its followers in order to control their behavior, in order to kind of engineer people who are going to fit into the system that he's trying to create to accomplish his goals. Kelsier is also deliberately and cynically creating a religion that is calibrated to resist the Lord Ruler's religion. And while that may be a more morally justified position than what the Lord Ruler is doing, it's fundamentally related to the Lord Ruler's project. In other words, there's this kind of push and pull in the magic system that makes these different powers interrelated. And in that same way, Kelsier is getting kind of mixed up with the Lord Ruler. There's a way in which the Lord Ruler has taught Kelsier how to be a religious leader. And we can see that reflected in Dilaf's behavior in Elantris, where he is very self-consciously, cynically, and deliberately engineering the religious lives of the followers, and the way that his religion is calibrated to be, like, everybody is in this chain of command kind of structure, where at the top of it, you have one person who controls everybody else in the religion through these different ranks. And Dilaf is, like, second to the highest person in the religion. So he is very proximate to the highest levels of power. That's the position that Kelsier is kind of setting himself up to be when he puts himself out there as the survivor of Hath Sin, the possessor of the 11th metal, and that he when he confronts the Lord Ruler, tells him, I am the thing that you cannot kill. I am hope itself. And then, having a Khandra there in order to have Kelsier kind of reappear or be kind of resurrected or survive the encounter of death is going to mythologize his agenda and give a kind of structured hope and direction to the Ska to resist the final empire, which is good, but still keeps them out of touch with that fundamental reality that I was talking about earlier. If they have this religion, that religion still obstructs their ability to encounter the actual reality of the Cosmere because it doesn't give them all of the information. It has been cynically constructed to kind of control them. And so that's why I say that in this book, things are a little bit more sophisticated and complicated. Sanderson has created these characters who are less archetypal and more interwoven with both heroic and villainous elements to them. Vin herself is constantly being pushed and pulled by the people around her. She forms these friendships with everyone in the crew, but she also forms friendships with the noble people who are supposed to be her enemies, that she's supposed to be manipulating and scamming. But she comes to see them as, fully three-dimensional kind of people in the same way that she is. She achieves a kind of vision of them, in other words, that has to do with equality. And that truly steps outside of the Lord Ruler's system, where there's a fundamental difference between the nobility and the Ska. And Vin is seeing in a more aligned way the actual truth that is fundamental about the world, that they are all people and that they all have similar kinds of needs and desires. And that's the vision that Vin is most afraid of, because it stands so distinctly against not only the way that she's been taught to live by the Lord Ruler's culture, but also by Kelsier and his crew's culture. That's just not the way that they see the world. But in a way, it's more of a polarizing kind of vision of things, more of a pushing or pulling than even what Kelsier is trying to attempt. And so I think there's something that's really in common that Vin has with Raoden in the way that she reacts to the world itself. Vin is in touch with that more fundamental reality when it comes to people and society and what's going to be necessary going forward than Kelsier and his crew are. Really more than any other character in the story at this point. But she feels that on a really instinctual, kind of emotional level, rather than an intellectual, deliberate, chosen level, the way that Kelsier does. And so there's lots of contrasts, lots of opposites that are built into this story. There's a real feeling of a kind of dialogical or Hegelian kind of disposition to this story. There's like opposites, light and dark. That's what I mean by Hegelian or dialogical, a kind of yin-yang energy that's happening in this book. And so where Kelsier has this really emotional reaction to the difference between the nobility and the Ska, Vin has this intellectual reaction to it where she can see the similarities between them, but that causes in her an emotional and instinctual reaction that there is equality between them, where Kelsier has to intellectually admit to that by the end of the story in order to change his emotions. And so that's the kind of way that I'm talking about, that there's this push and pull and this way in which the characters move each other while they are opposites of each other, one of them is coming at it intellectually while the other one is coming at it emotionally. Those things are still fundamentally attached to each other because of this kind of yin-yang relationship that is formalized in the story through the magic system. That where you have steel pushing and iron pulling, those are a kind of yin-yang of the same power, if you will. Where you can sense other people using magic, or you can smother the ability of anyone to sense you using magic. Those are kind of one actual thing, but they're two expressions of that one thing. They exist on a spectrum, in other words. And that's the way that Vin and Kelsier affect each other. The story is a lot of fun, having this whole heist crew scenario to it. And the beginning of the story for me always feels a lot lighter than where it ends. And the first trilogy only gets darker as it continues its story. I think it's a real achievement that he pulls you into this detailed and grounded world through a kind of whimsical notion of stealing a kingdom from the Dark One, right? That's a kind of almost goofy idea, but he shows you the way in which big things can be accomplished by taking many small steps. And that feels a lot like what Raoden does in Elantris to change the culture of this cursed city that was built on gang violence. He fundamentally undermines their culture by reframing what's possible and the meaning of kind of the disposition of the cursed people. He doesn't see it as a curse. In other words, he sees it as a blessing. And so Kelsier he kind of reframes what's possible in the world because he's this isn't any fundamentally different from scamming a noble person. We just happen to be scamming the God Emperor of reality, So it's bigger in its scale, but fundamentally it's just the same kind of thing that these guys do every day for their job. And so he has these leadership qualities that are very Raoden-esque, I think. And so you can see I talked about how Raoden is the kind of archetypal Cosmere hero. He doesn't really need to arc in that story because he already is the thing that Sanderson is going to be iterating on again and again. So he has a sense of vision. He is a natural leader. He has all this charisma. He's able to kind of misrepresent himself and disguise himself in the same way that Raoden does when he goes out and, Kelsier presents himself as an information broker and things like that. And so he has a lot of qualities that are in common with him. But like I said, those are interwoven with the ways in which he has things in common with Deloff. And so Kelsier is a real troubled character, I think, in Sanderson's mythos because he stands in a real liminal place between good and evil. He has these strong qualities of evil, but also of good. And so he never sits very comfortably in either one of those things. I don't think that Sanderson, and that doesn't really sit comfortably with Sanderson's entire style. I think he tends to characterize things in terms of if they're good, they're good. And if they're not good, then they're evil. And Kelsier is the kind of character who really messes with that. Him and Hoyd, I would say, mess with it the most. And they feel to me like the characters that Sanderson enjoys writing the most, but is the least comfortable with, on a personal level almost. And I didn't, mention Hoyd in Elantris, and I don't really plan to talk about him here either. He's such a minor character at this point. and it doesn't really have any, he's just like an Easter egg, really, and doesn't really have much of a characterization. But all of that to say that I think Kelsier, more than any other character in this book, sits in an uncomfortable place, and his sacrifice that he makes comes the closest to aligning him to a kind of heroic and good side of things, but at the same time completely takes him out of the game, if you will. And so the price of that kind of nudging more towards the good side is pretty steep. I think that Vin has some of the qualities that we see in Serene, and so does Sazed, in terms of like, there's, these qualities that Raoden has of being a kind of academic, like a researcher. But Serene is this really savvy political operator who is an activist. She's very in touch with building a community of resistance. So she has that in common with Kelsier as well. But I think Vin and Serene both have this quality of feeling like outsiders who never feel quite at home, even when they are in these kind of courtly environments, like the dances that Vin is in, or the king's court that Serene is in, or even the way that Vin doesn't feel totally aligned with Kelsier's crew or totally included by them. At one point in the story, she explodes on all of them that they are not really ska in the way that she is, and that in their behavior, they're fundamentally noblemen, and they don't understand what her life has been like. And so she doesn't feel like she fits in anywhere. And I feel like that's very aligned with the way that Serene is, calibrated in her story in Elantris, but informs the approach that she has to other people, that she cares a lot about justice because she feels so often left out in all of the situations that she finds herself in. She is treated unjustly, and so that's why it's important to her to treat others with justice. And I think in the same way, Vin has felt very unsafe growing up as part of thieving crews, and so making genuine connections with people that are built on authenticity and truth is very fraught for her, but very important at the same time. Like, it's something that she really, really wants, but something that she understands is very difficult or maybe even impossible to demand from the people around her. I like how Vin, in the story, her relationship with Sazed and the way that he is such a scholar and an academic, he rubs off on her, and she starts to become a reader and deeply reads. And she encounters Elend, who is the same kind of man already. Has a lot in common with Sazed on a certain level. And that's a thing that Vin is coming more and more closely aligned to, and is related to those heroic qualities that were so fundamental to Raoden in Elantris, where he finds the texts of the previous Elantrians that explain to him the theories and the fundamentals of how magic works, and that is what allows him to kind of save the day at the end of the story. Vin is very much similar to that, where she's not only learning about the magic system of the world, but she's experimenting with the 11th metal. She's reading the logbook of the Hero of Ages and learning about the deep and edited history of the world, learning about political theory from Elend, and all of those elements are what allow her at the end of the story to triumph over the Lord Ruler. At the end of the day, it doesn't come down to necessarily being more powerful or being the chosen one or something like that. It comes down to what Vin has learned through scholarship and the way that she synthesizes that knowledge to make a strategic choice at a very important moment in the fight. So once she realizes that the Lord Ruler is actually a talisman who is using feruchemy to enhance his allomantic powers, she understands where his weak point is and attacks that weak point. That can only happen through all of the scholarship that she does. And so when you compare her and Raoden in the climax of both of their stories, what it comes down to is the ways in which they have studied and then applied the knowledge that they worked so hard to gain. And so, again, Sanderson is making what is heroic in the Cosmere. It is deliberate scholarship, applied knowledge. It's not about a kind of fundamental comparison of power levels or the way in which, like my magic is cooler than your magic. I have the stronger staff or wand. It's nothing like that necessarily, because the Lord Ruler is so much more powerful than Vin is. What it comes down to is what Vin knows. And again, kind of closing that gap in knowledge between what is fundamentally true and what appears to be true. Vin realizes that the Lord Ruler has been lying to everybody, kind of misrepresenting who he is to the world, and that all of his behavior would seem to speak to him hating the Terracemen and the Terrace culture. But in truth, what he's been doing is trying to suppress their power, because that is the same as his power and could end up dethroning him. So just in the same way that Raoden closes the gap between the way that the world is represented in the Aeons and the way that it fundamentally is, Vin uses the 11th metal to reveal the fundamental identity of the Lord Ruler as Rashik, and then makes choices based on that fundamental knowledge that end up dethroning him. And so you can see a pattern beginning to emerge in the stories that has to do with scholarship, but especially about the fact that there is a truth to be discovered in the world, that truth is not a matter of perspective. Truth is something immovable and fundamental in Sanderson's Cosmere. And there's something about the magic system that reiterates on that idea, that kind of like reinforces it. When Vin is learning about, like creating the masking effect of the copper clouds, or using bronze to detect the different allomantic signatures, she's seeing them in the form of kind of, or experiencing them, I guess I should say, as kind of waves of having a pulse, having a rhythm to them. And that there's something kind of fundamental or almost scientific about that they are forces of nature in the universe, in the same way that we could talk about different colors in the spectrum of light having wavelengths, right? That there's something like a wavelength to the power that pewter gives you, or the power that tin gives you, and on like that. And that speaks to the way that light has this kind of fundamental element to it in the universe. That's the same thing that has to do with the magical systems. They are fundamental elements of the universe itself in the Cosmere. There's some bedrock truth about them that is immutable and written into the universe in the same way that the laws of gravity and electromagnetism and time and space are. And I think all of that is present in the universe of the Cosmere, because conversely, in the same way that the characters are kind of pushing and pulling on each other, just like the magic system is about pushing and pulling, the claim of the story is that there is something fundamental about people that can be discovered and said. There is something basic about what it is to be a person that is, quote unquote, true in a way that is immutable and unchanging in the same way that the laws of gravity, the laws of nature, the laws of magic are immutable and unchanging in the universe. That's kind of the claim that the Cosmere story at large is making about people, I think. But there are plenty of mysteries that are left at the end of the story. There's lots of openings for exploration and learning, and lots of questions that are left unanswered. And while, Vin has begun a journey of discovering, who she is not, if you will, she doesn't fundamentally know who she is. And that's true for so many of the other supporting characters in the story as well. And that's why there's 2 more books. And so I'll be moving to the second Mistborn book next time as I continue the Summer of Cosmere reading that I'm doing.